I'm so sorry. I was having computer trouble.
No problem. You're actually right on time. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then we'll go from there. Hello, everyone. My name is Keith Green, Executive Director for Publications at the BGHRA, and also Professor of English and Africana Studies at Rutgers University in Camden. I'm excited to introduce and moderate a conversation with these three wonderful panelists at this time. I'll begin by introducing the panelists before they speak. And after all three are presented, that will lead into questions by me, followed by comments and questions from the audience. But at any time, you can start to populate your questions using the Q&A feature of our webinar. And that Q&A button should be located at the bottom of our screen. Our first presentation is entitled African American Afro-German Women's Communities, a Comparative Study, and our presenter is Athena Myers. Athena Myers is currently a senior at Syracuse University studying advertising, creative writing, and sociology. She's currently doing research on the use of creative writing as a tool for social justice within marginalized communities. Coming from both German and African American heritage, she's particularly interested in drawing comparisons on the history of Black people in Germany and the US, along with how these communities have influenced each other. After graduation, she plans to pursue further study on the intersection of art and justice in Germany. Welcome, Athena. The floor is yours. You're currently muted. Just unmute yourself.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'll share my screen. If you give me a moment. Okay. Oh, it's giving me some trouble. Okay, so as mentioned before, this semester through my university, I've started doing research on female Afro-German and African American communities, specifically through the lens of their use of different art forms, specifically creative writing as a form of liberation. And I'm still in the beginning stages of my research, so it's ongoing. But by the end of my research, I want to have created an archive that encompasses the past 40 years up until present that really puts the creative writing of these two communities in conversation with each other as it relates to themes of liberation and identity and gender and race. So just some background, as someone with both Black and German heritage, the history of Black people in Germany has always been of interest to me. The presence of Afro-German people dates back to as early as the 1700s. And it's just been of interest to me because of the different avenues as to how Black people have ended up in different places, just globally, whether it be through voluntary migration more presently or the African diaspora. It's just very vast and an interesting point for critical reflection. And their presence in Germany, specifically contemporarily, is very prevalent. And the scope of my research as it relates to Germany is going to be focused primarily on Berlin, just to say that now. And then so last year, I studied abroad in Berlin at Freie University. And despite all the preemptive things I knew about German culture and my personal experience with it, being there and seeing firsthand how ingrained Black culture is into the city was really amazing. Their impact and presence in terms of various art forms, visual art, writing, music, fashion, food, and even the nightlife was really apparent. And seeing this was interesting because knowing how Berlin has been a major German city for contemporary social change, I wanted to take a look at the role of Black people in this, women specifically, and how art forms by them have served as proponents for justice during different movements. And I want to do so in a way that looks at it in conversation with Black American women who are writing about social justice at the same time, because even if they were different movements in different countries, the overarching themes and often goals were connected. And for decades, writing and other art forms within the social movements of Black communities have played a major factor in affecting both the movements themselves and fueling modes of Black artistic expression. So I've started looking at the past 40 years and seeing how the history of Black women's writings in each countries interact with each other and differ in content, context, and audience. And I'm traveling to Berlin next month to do more research on what it looks like presently, doing interviews and looking at some archives at institutions. But what I've been doing this far is focused on what it looks like historically. And I think that looking critically at Black transnationalism from this direct comparison standpoint will allow me to assess how creative writing in both the US and in Germany has and still can serve as a resource to and mode of justice amongst Black communities worldwide. So the work that I want to do with my research and I'm doing with my research is really connected to the work of Audre Lorde, who was an African-American author and activist. She's a poet. And I mentioned the role of transnationalism in my research, and this was something that she really valued as well. She was a member of the Black Panther Party, and her political ideology was really a driving force in her work. And she spent the last 8 years of her life in Berlin, Germany, between the years of 1984 and 1992. And during this time, she was really involved in the German political scene, specifically Berlin. And this was interesting because by this time, the US had obviously already had their first large Black civil rights movement, and we're now kind of entering this second wave of Black liberation, one that was characterized by ideals more radical than the ones before, such as like the early ideas of intersectionality. And and then she brought these ideals with her to Berlin, and she really served as an educational resource and is credited with being a sort of catalyst in creating this social shift in the Black community there. And this was also another interesting layer to this, was that her time there encompasses the periods directly before and after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the country and city was already experiencing a lot of political and social change. But through sharing her work and serving as an educational resource, by teaching at German institutions about the Black and the Black female experience, she does hold a degree of responsibility for really helping shape this movement, particularly amongst Afro-German women. And she really helped fuel a heightened awareness amongst the community there about their identity of Afro-Germans, something that really wasn't experiencing a lot of exposure before this, due to there being a lack of that first widespread like civil rights movement that the US had in the 50s and 60s. And so her helping set this framework in Germany for sharing Black women's work between cultures really helped a lot of Black German women realize that they have a very special and particular story to tell about their identity, and prompting a cultural shift and empowering Black women to make space for themselves there in a predominantly white German creative sphere. And like I said, I'm working on creating an archive that puts the writing of Black women and Black women creative writers from the US and Germany in conversation with each other, primarily poetry and creative nonfiction. And my scope is the past 40 years. So some of the American authors that I've been looking at so far is obviously Audre Lorde. And she has a lot of works that she wrote about being a Black American woman in Germany during her time there, which is really interesting as well. Pat Parker, who was a poet around the same time, and she wrote a lot about the intersections of her identity as being Black, gay, and a woman. Maya Angelou has a wide variety of poems that she wrote throughout her career that deal with themes of identity and being Black and a woman and the work that comes with doing so in America. She has a really amazing poem called On the Pulse of Morning that she actually read at the inauguration of Bill Clinton in the 90s. And some of the Black German women that I've been looking at, one is May Ayim, who actually worked closely with Audre Lorde during her time in Berlin. And she wrote this poem that I'll read. It's short. She says, "I will be African even if you want me to be German, and I will be German even if my Blackness does not suit you. I will go yet another step further, to the furthest edge, where my sisters, where my brothers stand, where our freedom begins. I will go yet another step further, and another step, and will return when I want, if I want, and remain borderless and brazen." And this is a theme that I'm starting to see in the work of a lot of the Black German women that worked closely with Audre Lorde during her time there, is sort of this kind of internal struggle going back and forth with society about what aspects of their identity that they should or shouldn't be identifying with. It's the common theme. And so we see this in the beginning where she says, "I will be African even if you want me to be German, and I will be German even if my Blackness does not suit you." And then towards the end, there's kind of this wholehearted acceptance of her Blackness and kind of connection to other people in the Black community. And another German writer that I started looking at, one that's more present, 1,000 Coils of Fear by Olivia Wenzel, was actually published in 2020. And she writes about being a Black German woman going back and forth between Berlin and New York during the chaos of the 2016 presidential election that was happening in the US. And there's a lot of themes of migration and relationships as a Black woman and just identity in general. And I actually saw a lot of parallels of her work to some of that of Bell Hooks, which I found really interesting, especially in Bell Hooks's book, All About Love. She talks a lot about navigating relationships as a Black woman and how much that's taught her about coming to terms with her own identity as a Black woman. And then just to wrap up, as I said that I'm in the process of creating an archive, and these are just some of the leading questions that I'm using as I research the history of Black women writers in both countries and look at what to add to it. The first one is, what social movements have functioned as catalysts for Black women creative writing in the US and in Germany? And in terms of catalysts in the US, obviously there's the impact of the Black Panther Party and also the gay rights movement as well, because during this time, and it gets more prevalent as we get more present day, there's an influx of a lot of Black queer women that are starting to write poetry and creative nonfiction about the intersections of their identity and what that looks like, navigating society as not just a part of one marginalized group, but three. And then in Germany, some of the catalysts are their first liberation movement in the 80s and also the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the next one I have is what are the primary factors that might affect the ability of Afro-German and African-American creative writing to interact with each other? This, I think I'll be able to learn a lot more about once I go to Berlin and do my research. But one of the things at the forefront, I think, will be just a fear of lack of understanding due to the obvious cultural difference in terms of nationality and also location. And then my third one is how do the motivations and audiences of Black creative writing by women compare in the US, compare in Germany versus the US? I think this is where I'm seeing a lot of their themes start to converge, because a lot of their work is kind of motivated by this overarching urgent need for change, whether it be in their direct communities or more widespread in society, or a combination of both. And then the last one I have are what are the dichotomies in the specific content of creative writing by African-American and Afro-German writers. So far in German writers, some of the dichotomies I'm seeing is a lot of talk about interactions with like individual oppressors and like in their direct communities, a lot of talk surrounding Nazism and just white supremacy in their direct communities, at least in the earlier works. And it kind of starts to experience a shift as I'm getting closer to the end of my scope. And then in a lot of the African-American writers, I see oppression talked about on a more institutional level in the earlier works. But yeah, as I create the archive for dissemination, I'd really like for it to be a resource to help shed light on the power of global creative conversation and how sharing art amongst historically underrepresented groups this way can help facilitate community-based change that can translate on a larger scale. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Athena. Our next presentation is entitled Blackness as an Accepted but Misunderstood and Mistreated Existence. And our presenter is Yanda Bango. Yanda Bango, who comes from South Africa and lives in Erfurt, Germany, is a fellow at the European Network Against Racism in Brussels. Her research at ENAR is focused on policing, law enforcement, and the criminal legal system regarding Black people and people of African descent. In this work, she explores decolonial and abolitionist frameworks as viable approaches for transformative justice. Yanda is an advocate for social and racial justice who has been active in civil society movements for over 13 years. She holds a master's in developmental sociology, from Rhodes University, and another one in development and governance from the University of Duisburg-Essen. Yanda, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. So today I'm presenting on Blackness. The topic is Blackness as an accepted but misunderstood and mistreated existence. So my reasoning behind this is that Black people do face a lot of discrimination and exclusion. One can sum it up to alienation, really, in the post-colonial society. So it is acknowledged that after our forebearers, our grandparents and parents resisted slavery and colonialism, they were finally acknowledged as full humans. But that acknowledgement didn't really come with an acceptance and understanding of our entire existence. The continued dehumanization remained, and I think it's been cushioned, or it manifests itself in systemic racism and white supremacy. So my main argument is that I attribute this to a commitment to ignorance, really. So I want to look at humanity as the starting point. And I looked at humanity and found that it is important because mainly it is acknowledged and accepted globally within the human rights framework. And its core is really about kindness and compassion towards human beings, regardless of your race. And with myself being an African, born and raised in South Africa, now living in Germany, I was raised with the specific philosophy of humanity. Some may look at it as a concept and a practice. So I'm sorry, I was raised with the philosophy of Ubuntu, and Ubuntu is quite similar to humanity when I observe it. Ubuntu is a Nguni word, and the phrase usually goes umntu ngumuntu ngabantu, and that means I am because you are. So it's focused on honoring the other person's existence because you see yourself in the other. So when you look at really this philosophy of Ubuntu, it's very similar. And one can also argue that it's actually the same as humanity. But even though that is the case, humanity continues to enjoy a universal status in the world, while on the other hand, Ubuntu is treated as a local and indigenous African practice. So it is very much shrunk and localized and compartmentalized. And so for me, this really speaks to the continued maintenance of this ignorance I'm talking about. But it acts itself out here in the sense that even though humanity is understood and acknowledged to be something that should be afforded to every human being, it is still to this day not applied to everyone. And so I think it's because of this commitment to ignorance. And there are other examples of that, but humanity is just the main one that stands out, or rather I think stands out. We also see it in language, and I think language has been very important. I found it to be quite interesting as well, moving to Germany, because I do come from a society that has already its own established language, languages actually. We value those languages back in Africa. And so coming into Germany and realizing the insistence upon the need to learn the local dominant language, I started questioning that. I didn't question it on the basis of the importance of language, because I do acknowledge and appreciate the fact that language is important. It's an important tool that we use to communicate and coexist amongst each other. But I started questioning this insistence of why foreigners particularly should immediately learn the local language in Europe, in Germany, specific to my context, because I found that it had this undertone of maintaining this inferiority and superiority binary between Black and white people in this case. And I found that it was also devaluing the language that I hold so dear and valuable, which I already come into Germany with. And so also it took me back to South Africa actually, and Africa at large, which languages are valued. If you are a European going to Africa, you don't necessarily have to learn the local languages. There haven't been any pressure since slavery, colonialism, and up to date to learn the local languages. You can make your way around Africa, depending on which parts of the continent you are, with French, Portuguese, or English. And in South Africa, it's English. I've met people who have said they've been in the Southern Africa since for 6 generations when they trace their ancestral lineages. And it is well known that many of those people of European descent in Africa, not only the southern parts of Africa, do not speak African languages. And so that just speaks really to the power dynamics behind the use of language. And it confirms really this devaluing and dehumanization of the African people. And I see that to be prominent in Europe at large as well. So I think it should be questioned because it maintains these inequalities, and as a consequence of that, Black people continued to be mistreated and misunderstood, not because it's not possible to understand them, but because there hasn't been an interest and there hasn't been a push to actually start moving beyond accepting that it's not only about the hosting foreigners and forcing them, or rather imposing that they should learn the cultures and even the languages of the host community, but actually for them to also contribute with what they bring in. And so this actually leads me to the second example, which is healing practices. So I made an observation, again, coming to Europe as an African, that maybe it became prominent because it's not like it doesn't happen in Africa as well. It's a universal phenomenon that we subscribe to Western and European standards of healing. And so the medication, for instance, that we use for ailments is Western medication that you will get from pharmacists, prescribed by your doctors, etc. But as an African, having grown up in Africa and knowing that there are other methods, example, in my Xhosa culture and community, we've got specific methods of healing. So there's ukugaba, ukufuta, and ukucima. So that is the basic really methods that any or most African children will know back in my community. So I'm bringing this up because if you now come into a society that does not understand this, let's say I'm being treated by a doctor who is not aware of my background as an African and doesn't even take an interest in understanding how healing works in my culture, then you might misdiagnose me. The medication that you give me might not work relevant to my context. And it's not because I'm not using that medication properly. It's just that it is at loggerheads with my understanding and response to healing as an African being. Because also, for some Africans, healing is not only about the physical ailment, but it is also a spiritual thing. And so your response to your healing is also often viewed and approached in holistic terms. And so I'm raising this point to challenge and to push really for the normalization within European contexts to start when talking about diversity and inclusion, actually focusing and respecting the fact that there needs to be a committed effort towards taking an interest, learning as well about the cultures, background specifically of the people that you will be helping and interacting with throughout. And the last point that I took note of was culture, which is very prominent. And culture, in simple terms, I describe as the customs, the norms, the standards, the values, and the practices of a host society. Again, coming from Africa, I already have a culture which is very much established and I am proud of. But there's a sense as Africans when you're coming into Europe that you need to let go of this or carry some shame because they are not included and they're not accepted. And I observed and realized that in as much as it is not said, it is not said verbally and vocally, you can tell that the insistence is there through the obsession of rules and regulations, which I found in a way to be imprisoning in Germany. And it's not to say rules and regulations should not be there. I can respect the existence of rules and regulations, but if the rules and regulations are put in place or they function for me as an outsider to prevent me from fully expressing me, from fully expressing myself and from fully existing in this foreign community, then it is a problem. And so these 4 examples that I just raised speak to the fact that when Africans, but I would like to extend it beyond Africans because it applies really to non-European foreigners who enter Europe with their backgrounds, is that their existence, so which is characterized by the knowledges that they come with, the languages, the cultures. It is questioned often. It is shrunk and compartmentalized, where our knowledge, for example, is called indigenous, as opposed to being a knowledge, or if you will call it indigenous, then European knowledge should also be called indigenous because it is knowledge from Europe, even though we have now accepted it as dominant and universal knowledge. It actually isn't, and that is something we should start questioning a lot. Because when this is not questioned, when this attitude and approach towards what counts and who counts in what is articulated and understood, then as Africans and our knowledges and consequently existence, we're delegitimized, we are silenced in many ways, and our knowledges and also ultimately existence is erased. And this erasure is not new. It has been happening, many can argue, since the beginning of slavery. We saw it happening during colonialism, apartheid for a South African. So we know that these are really these are colonial traits, these are colonial legacies and continuities, and they're manifesting themselves through this way. And so again, I take it back to the fact that it's a commitment to ignorance, because it is not like we don't know that there are injustices, inequalities behind these practices, and mainly attitudes that insist on alienating people who don't subscribe or have not assimilated to European customs and norms. But it is just that they serve a certain purpose. And for us, non-Europeans, they are problematic because they enable and maintain, also reproduce the criminal legal system, which is very much racist. In fact, all sectors of society, because if you look at the education system, you will find racism. If you maybe zoom into the curriculum, health sector, the same, you will find a lot of racist tendencies and elements. Employment, all sectors of societies really. And it speaks to the fact that the dominant public discourse is unrepresentative. And in order for it to be representative, Europe and the global North at large needs to start taking seriously the fact that they have to also start doing their homework, which is learning about other ways of knowing and being, as opposed to sifting them through and deciding what applies and what doesn't apply and how it should apply. Context should be applied within their context and understood within their frameworks alongside other, which is the European knowledge system and way of understanding. Then we can take them forward together equally, not using the European understanding and framework of knowing and doing things as the universal and supreme one. I think when this is done, perhaps the expectation will not be so high, and also the demand that it is foreigners who need to assimilate, but actually that nobody needs to assimilate. Everybody can take ownership of who they are, where they come from, and what they offer, and all of that can be used to contribute to the future. And so the proposal then ultimately that I come with is that we should start by firstly rejecting Europeanness as universal or representative, because it is not. And moving forward specifically for Black people. And when I talk about Black people, I don't only refer to the race, but I think I want to specifically refer to African people and people of African descent. So anybody who identifies as an African, and ultimately, actually, when you look at Black consciousness and its tenets, I think it is applicable to anybody who experiences marginalization. But of course, within this context, as a Black human being, the focus and concern is about that. And so Black consciousness is great, I think, because it's really the road towards emancipation, which is what we need. And it is also a commitment to fight against all the forces that seek to use Blackness as a stamp of subservience. And also it's the realization by Black people to rally together as brothers and sisters around the cause of our humanity, and to operate as a group in order to rid ourselves of the chains that bind us to perpetual servitude. And what I like about Black consciousness is that it teaches and empowers us to unapologetically love and appreciate the things that we have been taught to hate about ourselves. And this is very important. For instance, our skin tones, our hair, our body structures, languages, which I have touched on, our healthy ancestral practices, our spirituality, identity, and in essence, the core of who we are as human beings. And it also propels us to own our narratives and to reclaim our identity as a measure of restorative justice. So yes, my proposal is that Black consciousness is an approach we should try and in a way normalize, and I don't want to use universalize because it has been captured itself, but also include really alongside the dominant ways of existing and understanding our humanity, first as Africans, but most importantly as human beings alongside other human beings. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Yanda. And so our final presentation is entitled Black German Arts and Culture, Building the Institute, and our presenter is Dr. Natasha A. Kelly. Natasha Kelly has a PhD in Communication Studies and Sociology. She's the author and editor of several books, a curator and artist. Her art installations were shown at diverse museums throughout Germany. She made her film debut at the 10th Berlin Biennial in 2018 with her award-winning and internationally traveled documentary, Millie's Awakening. Among others, Dr. Kelly made her theater director debut with the adaptation of her dissertation, Afro-Culture, The Space, Yesterday, and Tomorrow, at the Gota Theater in Salvador de Bahia, Brazil. The piece was later put on stage in the USA in 2020. Based on her edited volume, Sisters and Souls, her annual empowerment theater series, My Sister, was staged under her artistic direction and memory of the Afro-German poet Maya Yim at the Hebel am Ufer Theater in Berlin from 2016 to 2018. The second edition of Sisters and Souls 2 was published in 2021 with her bilingual publication and exhibition, The Comet, Afrofuturism 2.0, and the prior symposium of the same name. In 2018, Dr. Kelly moved away from historical representations and towards visions of the future. Her book, Racism, Structural Problems Need Structural Solutions, is a response to Black Lives Matter Germany in 2020. Forthcoming books include Mapping Black Europe, Monuments, Markers, Memories, as well as Black, German, Women, In fall and spring 2022, Dr. Kelly held a Max Cade visiting professorship at the University of Rhode Island, and Colorado College. In summer 2022, Dr. Kelly was a distinguished visiting professor at the Institute of Media Studies at University of Tübingen in Germany and Max Cade visiting professor at Middlebury College. Presently, Dr. Kelly is in the process of founding Germany's first Institute for Black Germany, Arts and Culture. Dr. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to my four speakers, Athena and Yanda. I think that my presentation especially fits perfectly into what you were saying, Yanda. It literally adds on. I could just literally just continue to flow into exactly that by taking on the challenge of empowering ourselves as Black Germans and building an institute that is actually a Black German institute. For me, would be the summary of what you or the consequence of what you were talking about. And this idea came to mind during the pandemic, where we were locked at home in front of our Zoom computers, etc., PP, dealing with all sorts of issues that we definitely were not prepared for. And that in this same phase, then the Black Lives Matter movement literally exploded globally. And since then, Germany has been in this phase of diversity. You know, this is the new thing. Diversity, the problem is, though, it only serves the white majority society, which is literally turning the concept on its head. If we think of what the origin of diversity is, that it actually came out of the Black Revolution, if you want to put it as that, be it the Black Arts Movement, Black Civil Rights Movement, etc., everything that led to a step towards our freedom, let's put it that way. I think that the problem that we have here in Germany is that the whole anti-racist work is only focused on this one trail of diversity. Asking how white people feel that now that they know they're white since 2020, what they're going to do with their whiteness, how to deal with it. That has been the ongoing discussion. It's slowly dying down. But nobody was actually looking at what Black lives, how they matter, how do they even play into this? Yeah, it all became this all lives matter thing. So the other side of the medal is or an offer or a suggestion would be actually decolonization. The new government has now actually put it in their agenda to deal with German colonialism. And I think that this is actually the first time that political parties are dealing with these topics on this level. In activism and in universities, we've reached this point quite some time ago. So politics are lacking behind, where we know from decolonial theory, if we look at the three pillars of decolonial theory, which would be knowledge, power, and beings, it is only where these three intersect that we actually, as Black Germans, have a space where we can actually decolonize, meaning deconstructing a structure, creating a space that we can actually enter to then create in this space. You know? Because what we have been doing in the past decades is literally creating inside a structure, to put it in Audre Lorde's words, in which we were never meant to survive, you know, which then automatically leads to to our exhaustion, to you know, this, as we say in German, fighting the windmills, you know, a fight that you cannot win. Looking at these 3 points that always intersect, I think it's really important to say that you can look at them individually, but never separately from each other. So if we look at knowledge, we always have to take knowledge power into consideration, but also beings, as you said, holistically, not only the body. This is something that Germans like to do, reduce the being to the physical body, but it's also everything that goes along with it, the mind, the soul, religion, emotions. Yeah, this is especially where art comes in. The creative writing aspect, the poems come in. This is and how Audre Lorde would challenge the German system of being very emotionless as they say, you know. So yeah, taking these three things into consideration, not separating them, but looking at them individually to highlight where they intersect. If you start with beings, the body itself, this is where, for me, especially as somebody who works with the body in performing arts, or even down to poetry or spoken word, let's take that as a better example. You are actually in your body moving, connecting your movement with words, so to say. So your body is part of the whole performance. And looking at this through a decolonial lens is literally where our colonial heritage left us. As Black Germans, we're on the stages on white stages in the during colonialism. This was like in the entertainment industry, was the only space where a Black body could literally survive, or maybe in film. We have a lot of stories from survivors of the Holocaust, like Theodor Michael, for example, who tells his story how he survived on the film set of these colonial films. So the body was put in the Black body was put in very specific spaces. And in order to decolonize this and actually come to the point where we could create an institute, we had to go back to that space and use this space as a point of departure for our bodies. Yeah, this is how we literally started this process to say that we no longer want to be set in stereotypical roles where the white audiences, be it of theaters, of media, in museums, you name it, want to see or hold Black people in certain stereotypes, in certain positions, yeah, under certain circumstances. Because we didn't only learn to speak from white men, we also learned to see from them as well. So the way we observe is also very, very Eurocentric, you know? Our vision then was to say, we need to leave that behind. We need these in-between spaces. As Maya Yin would always put in so many different ways so beautifully, was to actually enter this space and recreate this space. Yeah, our vision was to leave the Eurocentric zone behind, or what Frantz Fanon coined the zone of non-being, where we literally had been stuck forever, so to say, and to enter an Afrocentric zone of being, which means also perceiving our bodies in a different way. This is something that, as a Black German, many Black Germans growing up with white parents only would even have to learn to do, you know, to understand, how would I comb my hair? Why would I constantly be creaming my skin, just to give easy, practical examples. The second thing to describe this space is that it reaches beyond coloniality and modernity. These are also two things that intersect, that people also like to separate from each other. But coloniality and looking through a decolonial lens, coloniality and modernity actually are dependent on each other. Without coloniality, there would be no modernity. Without modernity, there would be no coloniality. So in the course of time, we're going through postmodern stages, post-colonial stages. We're always still stuck in the structure that we're trying to deconstruct. And everything that we do, it's only in accordance to the structure that already exists. So beyond this space, beyond the coloniality, beyond modernity, is the space where we entered and located, so to say, from a mindset point of view, the institute, that we said, we've seen movements like this before. We're not even, we wouldn't even be the first to do it. If we look at, for example, the Harlem Renaissance in the USA in the early 1920s, they did, I would compare it to exactly that, what happened then, that they pulled away from or literally escaped from the white mind, created spaces where they could be creative, where art could be performed, written, or whatever visual art was going on at the time. A decade later, we look at the Negritude movement, which was a similar movement, it came out of a similar motivation to create in the Francophone world, France, but also French-speaking Africa. That was the connection, especially Senegal. If you look at the Descartes Biennale, this literally grew out of the Negritude movement. And but they had a different focus, more to say that they were connected to the continent, yeah, and wanted to create a different way of seeing African art, which is during that time very prominent in Europe in general, due to colonization and all the looted goods that reached here during that time. And what we thought, now that we've defined the space that we want to enter, we actually then said what we need to do now is to define what Black aesthetics means in a German context. Because what doesn't work is to just transpose US American aesthetics. This has been happening through the Americanization of West Germany since before the Second World War, I would say, and has been going on forever. Or you have this Francophone movement, which is not as large as the Americanization of culture in Germany, but we need to also shift that aside to actually have a place to define what Black aesthetics means in a German context, yeah? And projects that I have done, I've just brought one practical example to show you where the work of this institute would be going. So we want to use art to create knowledge, or to produce knowledge, so to say, and to produce this, the Black German aesthetic, whatever that may be. Everybody asks me, so what is that? Is that already happening? That is the vision. I don't know what it is. We won't know until we actually get there, so to say, what it is, what it will look like, what it will feel like, what it will taste like, what it will, but this is something that literally has to happen. This is for me, really the next logical move into the future and heading closer to freedom. But I'll just quickly, I don't know how much time I still have, but let me share my screen with you, because this is one example of a project that I did where I was already dealing with this, but more as a temporary site. And the institution that we're creating is really a permanent institution where we're also already in discussion. I don't want to say where and when or anything, but it really is about having a performing space, having office space, and then growing the institute out of this, using our bodies as the starting point. Not having power debates like we constantly do here in Germany. Is she allowed to, does the white man allowed to do this? Is the white man, I just cannot hear that conversation anymore. Or is this racist? Is this not racist? These are things happening. That's over there with diversity. We are now here in the zone of creating a new zone of being, so to say, yeah? And one person who already did this, where it comes to maybe your idea of Ubuntu, where I totally related to what you were saying there, was Anton Wilhelm Amo. And let me just pull this back. I don't know how much you can see right now. So in 2017, that was the 500 years of Martin Luther in Wittenberg. There was a huge celebration of arts and science, and celebrating Martin Luther in the city where he was born. And I was invited to install one of these glass palaces, as they were called, by Michaela Roth and sociologist Irmtraut Vogelmeier from Vienna. And there were 12 of these glass palaces, and each one was installed by a different artist to a different topic that in some way related to Wittenberg and the 500-year anniversary of Martin Luther. And because Anton Wilhelm Amo, who some of you might know, he was the first African professor at a German university. We can go into a discussion to say was he still African, because he was stolen as a child, grew up in Germany, spoke 5 different languages, learned law, philosophy, I don't know, you name it. Sometimes I ask myself when they even had the time to do all that back then. but he did like all these amazing things, became the first professor at a German university and studied in Wittenberg. Yeah. So for me, the connection was that one of his dissertation, so this was the wagon that I did, or the glass palace that I did, and his dissertation titled On the Rights of Black People in Europe is gone missing. So we don't know where it is, we don't know that, but there is actually proof that he did defend his dissertation in the archives of the university. So we know that this book actually existed. So I represented this book made out of glass and put it in the glass palace, so to say, and called my palace the African Diaspora Palace. Here hanging over it is the Sankofa symbol. And down in the corner, I set the whole palace in the context of the International Decade of People of African Descent, which is ending next year, the end of next year. And the visitors who would walk by, I gave a rose or flowers of different colors and would talk about Anton Wilhelm Amo and ask them if they would like to then place it down. You know, and so this was like a temporary memorial site. Yeah. And engraved in this glass book was a quote from Anton Wilhelm Amo: "It's not enough to tell the truth unless the cause of the untruth is also determined." I'll leave it at that now. But I was there six weeks, and throughout the time, these the flowers started to dry up, you know. And sorry, this way I was able to pull the visitors into conversation. So I was literally creating what we now want to make a permanent institute by starting with one of our first, Anton Wilhelm Amo, leading right up to present day artists, activists, and the work that we do, of course, including Maya Yim, Audre Lorde, and all that time, and practically using Anton Wilhelm Amo as a vehicle to transport knowledge. It was a vehicle, so it was on wheels. So we practically were able to drive through the city. We drove through the city center, and we would stop at open lots, yeah, that then symbolized the missing gap, the missing link. And then we would, so to say, bring in the idea that in these gaps, there's something that needs to be standing there, so to say, our institute, which is now in the making. This plaque, as we call it, I don't know if that's the right English word, of Anton Wilhelm Amo is actually hanging at the university and the court of the university. But here he's not named as a professor, but as the first African student, which then also goes hand in hand with what you were saying, that our knowledge is literally just disseminated, reduced to, which also then is where knowledge and power connects, because if we're not seen as knowledgeable bodies, then we don't gain power, right? So it's all literally connected. We had different events. This is a poetess, a young poetess who joined us, as Professor Marba. So when we were driving through the city, we had, we stopped at different places, just took out our chairs and then started to have conversations, so to say, with the passers-by, who we set up these benches that they could listen. And the topic actually was on human rights, and that's why I found your Ubuntu approach really so interesting, because Anton Wilhelm Amo, he was a human rights activist. As we can take from the title, he was fighting for the rights of Black people in Europe. So he was a lawyer, but he was fighting at a time even before human rights had been ratified in Europe. You know, so taking what you said into consideration, he's even bringing the Afrocentric idea with him to Germany. We don't know, unfortunately, because this book is missing, what would have been translated into today's memories, let's say. And it's after a few weeks, this is how it looked, because obviously the leaves, they shriveled up. and became, less and less. You know how when it dries, it just reduces down to nothing. And at the end of this period, practically, there was nothing left apart from the continuing vision to have a permanent space in society, an institutional space, which is not only an academic space, let me stop here for now, which is not only an academic space, but which we deliberately call an Institute of Black German Arts and Science and Culture, which in German doesn't translate very well, I have to say. That's why it's much longer in German. We would say an Institut für schwarze deutsche Kunst, Kultur und ihre Wissenschaften, because we need this knowledge aspect in it, because the art that we want to do, the performing arts, but we also work with the digital curator, digital arts curator. We want to be informed by Black knowledge and through the Black consciousness, but through a Black German consciousness, because I think that that is really, really important for where we're going. And I will end there. I don't know if I was over time. I kind of like lost my, but okay.
Yeah, you were actually perfect on time. We actually have until 3:15, so we have plenty of time for conversation. So I'll note that, again, for our audience members, you can place your questions in the Q&A tab right at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And also, I'll start us off with a few questions and comments, but please go ahead and place your questions or comments in that Q&A box. So I'll start first with Athena, although I think that this question probably applies, I think, to all three of the panelists, who I think in lots of ways we're speaking to each other on a few different levels. And so you mentioned that your archive is involved with creative writing for both, Black women in both the US and Germany. And I was struck by the fact that your choice of creative writing as a kind of medium, as opposed to, say, newspaper articles, academic essays, some other type of medium. And want to kind of pose a question, which I think, again, applies to the other panelists as well. What is it about creative writing that you think kind of has value, that you think has kind of power to disrupt systems and ideas, which are often not questioned?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, I mentioned in my presentation that kind of art in general has kind of been used as an avenue for justice within like various marginalized communities throughout history. But I think when it's talked about, the majority of the time we focus on visual art. And I think there's just like an untapped into aspect that I thought there was with creative writing, especially due to the fact that I talked about Audre Lorde a lot in my presentation, and creative writing was kind of like the avenue she used to kind of bridge a connection with the Black female community there. So I think that it would be a really interesting point for research just to focus on that specifically, because it had such an impact in the Black female community in Germany in the 80s. And so many Black women in the US were writing about justice at the same time also. And yeah, so that's why I decided to choose creative writing.
Thank you for that. And so then for Yanda, I had a question in terms of your intervention of this idea of Black consciousness, which I think is so important and valuable. I mean, people, for instance, such as, Sylvia Winters, for instance, have kind of questioned this category of the human, which appears to be universal and appears to be transparent and innocent. But we know that this idea of the human comes about at a time where Europeans are positioning themselves, right, as, right, the human. And so when we talk about kind of, human rights, in some sense, the category, right, the concept itself of human rights is already one which is bankrupt, which is problematic. And so I think the turn, right, to think about then African knowledges and centering, right, local specific, right, places and language, right, in the African continent is really so critical. But I also kind of wonder then how you were thinking through like the complex position, I think, of, for instance, of Africans living in Germany, for instance, right, who have both an experience of language and culture, identity and family that's shaped by their African experiences, but also then how those experiences, identities are then intersecting with what they're experiencing elsewhere. And so, I mean, I guess terms like double consciousness, intersectionality might kind of do the work here, but how you're thinking through how Black consciousness is also complicated within itself. If you just had some ideas, reflections on what that has been like for you in terms of thinking through the nuances of, which I think is a really valuable term, of Black consciousness.
Yes, thank you, Keith. Yeah, I'll start with the idea of being a human. I think that was also my point of departure, because I realized that there's this universal, as it should be, idea of what it means to be a human being, but actually it's inconsistent because it doesn't apply to everybody. And of course, the further you are from being white, I'll put it explicitly like that, the further you are from being fully human. And it shouldn't be. So already the starting premise is wrong. And I was questioning that. I was very much inspired by the decolonial thought. And so when I looked into Black consciousness, I referred to Steve Biko, and Steve Biko was a decolonial scholar. I found Steve Biko especially empowering because he specifies that we experience discrimination and oppression specific to the context. And because of that, certain movements and people might try to divide us because of our differences. But actually, we shouldn't allow for that to be the case. If anything, we should sit in our different specific areas of interest and specific areas in which we experience discrimination, unite, understand each other, understand our struggle, and then get out, go and join forces in the bigger movement of those who are also experiencing the struggle. Because at the end of the day, human rights injustices and violations are exactly that. And when we connect on the basis of humanity, we can empathize with each other. When we connect on the basis of humanity, I can value the fact that we experience the same emotions. I know joy, I know pain, I know trauma. Even if I might not know your specific trauma because you haven't experienced it, I can empathize. And so that empathy should be enough for me to value your struggle. It should be enough for me to not want to reproduce the injustice that you're experiencing due again to this ignorance and unwillingness to undo what you are suffering from. And so I liked also the fact that Natasha was specific in saying that what they are trying to do as Black Germans is to focus on the Black German vision. That is important. And I think it fits also into what Steve Biko was talking about. And so I specifically, as an African coming from South Africa, and anybody for that matter, should not find that as offensive. It's necessary. It's necessary. It's a process and form of empowering yourself, and also really solidifying who you are, being specific in what you are responding to, so that when you go and meet with other people who are experiencing similar struggles, you can specify and say, this is the priority for me. And so moving forward, what is our priority as a collective? But if we have to at some point take a pause and focus on our respective struggles, it's okay. We shouldn't have to be divided by that, but we should actually empathize and find unity and strength and use our resources to see which of the struggles can be supported at a specific time. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but really that was my train of thought. The realization that when you talk specifically about an African person or a Black person, and I did say when I'm referring to a Black person, I'm not only focusing on the skin tone, but mainly really people of African descent and people who still do come, who are Africans. So as long as you feature into that category, you will be affected by this. And you know this because the further you are from being white, especially when you are in a Eurocentric and Western society, the further you are from being fully human. And so they treat being a human being as a privilege, as if it is something that you should aspire for, when actually it shouldn't. It's a born, given natural right that everybody should be enjoying, regardless of where they come from, who they are, and what they think. And so we need to start normalizing that and denormalizing the fact that it should be a privilege, because it isn't. It isn't, and we shouldn't accept that.
Yeah, I think those are such profound points. And I think about even in the wake of, you know, again, globally, right, the kind of massacre of people of color, and the ways in which those victims are then called upon, right, even from the dead, right, to kind of prove their humanity. Oh, but this person had a degree from this institution. This person was, you know, respectable. That doesn't matter, right? If a life is taken, right, that life is already valuable within itself. And so this kind of idea that we have to kind of prove our humanity over and over again, even in death, I think is really profound. I was also struck by how the concept of Ubuntu also challenges individualism, right? Because if I am because you are, this also suggests that our core, right, sense of self can't just simply come, right, in isolation. Like, we need community. And so I thought that was also a really important intervention. I had a question for Natasha, and I see a Q&A comment, which I'll get to in a second. But Natasha, as you were talking about kind of what the Institute could be, and as you're kind of developing it and kind of walking through kind of, it's really kind of critical interventions in terms of thinking through how we might imagine knowledge differently, and seeing that, you know, that glass palace kind of moving through space, right? We think about kind of knowledge being in a certain place and situated and literally stable, but kind of having that mobility kind of really struck me as another way in which we can decolonize knowledge. So maybe if you could just speak to some of the ways in which you see kind of art as working in a different type of register than, let's say, you know, an encyclopedia, or like you mentioned, plaque, right? Like the plaque is kind of one symbol of how information is transmitted and how it's officially, you know, sanctioned. But maybe then some other models, such as that kind of moving, you know, palace, as ways of deconstructing what we think of as true, as relevant, as important.
Mm-hmm. I think, but maybe that's because I'm a communication scientist. It's the digital that for us is like really, really, really important, because through the digital, we're able to cross national borders, continental borders, etc. We're out in digital space, creating space. At the same time, we're well aware that there are the vector companies on top, be it Google, YouTube, or you name it, you know. So then we're in a whole different matrix of that. But I think that for the German context, this is one thing, not only going online, but also using the digital, for example, as a tool. I mentioned before, for example, that we have a studio space, so it's a small theater with around 50 seats. I think we have, plus minus. And what we're planning, or what we're working on, is to use the digital as the setting, the scenery. Because the space is very compact, we can't be building, you know, big sceneries, big settings like you would be used to in a theater, and everything, you know, pulls up and comes down and you know it. So all of this is happening digitally. We're working with digital costumes. We're going in the direction of avatars. We're going in the direction of gaming, but also of hybrid events that, for example, take place in different German cities at the same time in physical spaces within the communities, but then are streamed, and the program, so to say, runs through these different cities. So we would start with one event in Hamburg, the next event would be in Berlin, the third program point would be in Munich, and so on. And you can watch what's happening in these different cities at the same time. So with this idea is not only using the digital to, you know, as a two-dimensional platform, I would say. We open up and Zoom comes and, you know, we're all watching each other, but it really is as a tool, as a creative tool, but also as a connector You can use it in so many ways. And so the digital is for us really important. The visual, obviously, is really important. That comes automatically with the digital visual art. Online exhibitions, that will be something that we are definitely looking to do. And in that way, overcoming the nation state, because this is, if you look back at German history, practically, race and nation were intersected. No, that's why Germans are often considered to be white and blonde and blue-eyed, etc., because you cannot separate it from race. And today we still get asked, so where are you from, and where are you really from, and those kind of questions. Yeah? And Black seen something that is not here. No, so we still to this day are not part of the nation. But for us, it's not about looking at what are the outer borders anymore, or be it the nation state, be it the structural on a meta level, but it's really about centering Blackness. Yeah, and this is literally our starting point. And if you understand Blackness as all of these things intertwining with each other, knowledge, power, and bodies or beings, minds, souls, and as I explained before, that is what we're starting with. So whiteness is not at the center anymore of what we do. So it doesn't matter anymore. Well, it will always matter because it will always be here, and it's great. And white people are invited to come to our shows and everything. I'm not saying that, but it's just the starting point of creation is a different point, as in being in this binary system all the time, and everything we do, we have to do and according to what the structures allow us to do. No, and in that sense, that's the reason why there is no such thing as Black aesthetic in this country, because you can have Black people doing art, yes, but they're doing art inside of white institutions, which limits their actual artistic freedom, because you only have, up to the structures, but not beyond. And what we are looking to do is how can we imagine art if these structures now don't exist? What even comes out of all of that? But not only in the sense of creating visual art or statues or that, but also when it comes to writing, when it comes to academia, when it comes to doing research, which are actually the tools that then are profitable for where we want to go as Black Germans. And I use Black Germans just to add on one last point, as really all Black people in this country. And I don't care if African American, Caribbean, Afro-Brazilian, you name it. Once the center of your life is in this country, you're stuck with us in this space. So we all need to work together. That's the whole Ubuntu idea where it comes in. Yeah, what for me is like really important, which allows us to let go of this universalism, this individualism, this stronger, better, high-end performance that we have here in this part of the world. You have to be richer, stronger, have to work harder, and we're actually forgetting, or sometimes not even knowing who we are. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And thank you so much for that response. I mean, so this is a question which kind of jumps off of that response, and any panelist could kind of take it on. But what do you think is the role of experimentation or even kind of risk in charting forth a kind of Black consciousness? As you're kind of saying in Germany, thinking through like what would a Black aesthetic look like, to some extent, then people might kind of long for, kind of want like a stable set of, sayings or, experiences which kind of lock it together. And of course, the Black German experience is so different and nuanced in a way that maybe that kind of core isn't there. So it feels to me that what I heard from all three of you saying is that somehow experimentation, right, this kind of idea of risk might also be central to kind of thinking through what an archive looks like, what Black consciousness looks like, right? What type of, infrastructure, right, would allow for the kind of risk-taking that's involved in charting forth something which doesn't feel predetermined. So perhaps any of you could kind of touch on how you see experimentation or risk being a part of the work that you're doing or connecting to others.
Well, I would say as you know, on the one hand, yes, experimentation as a form of practice, in the sense of free your mind and schooling your imagination, that yes, but not in the form of being non-factual and non-academic. And that, I think, is where the danger lies, that people can, that's why it was for the title for us was so important, to have in a German context the academic in this row, because in Germany, when you talk about arts, you're literally talking about visual arts or performing arts. You're not talking about academic art as an art form, yeah? And academia is literally what informs the arts, that you have these three bubbles: knowledge, bodies, and power, that cannot be separated. That's the whole important point. It moves like a together, no? And that is really important. Not just say, okay, our bodies can do what our bodies cannot do. Our bodies can't move without our mind, and our mind doesn't function without knowledge, and so on. Yeah. So, and that would be my connection to the Black consciousness, literally. I don't know.
Okay. I think experimentation as a process really of recreating a different, more humane society at large is essential. It's necessary. Maybe we can look at it as being experimental, and others would look at it as actually exploring other facts, other realities that exist out there. And so for me, I think it's complementary, whether we are saying it's being experimental or exploring. It is necessary. It's necessary, and it complements each other. And it's also essential, actually, because it leads us to where we want to go, which is rejecting universalism, number one, because it is centered on whiteness or Eurocentrism, and finally opening up the door for inclusivity, and decolonial scholars call it pluriversalism. And I think it captures it really nicely and well, because you are literally saying we are recreating, we're changing the rules of engagement, and we are co-creating together equally a world that respects, acknowledges every other knowledge system that everyone is bringing in to contribute and to redefine really our understanding of how we should view each other and live with each other as human beings, being informed by our different backgrounds. So yes, I would say I fully encourage it, and I think it's necessary because it taps into our creativity, it taps into our freedom as human beings. It also touches on the elements that have often been ignored by the Eurocentric approach, which is spirituality, which is the emotional element of it. So it's quite mindful, and I would say maybe it would help to lead us into a more holistic approach.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I agree with Yanda and how we need to like sort of reframe this narrative, because I feel that Black people globally who grow up in predominantly white areas spend so much time struggling with how to navigate white spaces. That's like what they struggle with, like for the majority of their life. Like, how do I navigate this space? How do I navigate this space? And I feel that we could really remove a lot of this like pressure that we put on ourselves to assimilate onto these spaces if we focused a lot more of our energy onto community-based organization, and kind of, instead of trying to navigate these spaces, build our own spaces and focus our energy on that. So yeah, I'm fully in support of experimentation when it comes to Black people in the arts.
Wonderful responses. Let me address a couple comments that we have, questions in the Q&A. So the first is for Yanda. It's crucial to maintain the fact that the popularized concept of humanity developed in Europe actually inspired by the Christian religion, was in reality not conceived for all peoples. Otherwise, colonization, which came after it, would not have been such a popular endeavor. Hence, my deep appreciation for Yanda's point of emphasizing African concepts of humanity among Black peoples, home and in the diaspora, which are certainly more encompassing and more authentic. The next is to Natasha, and these are both from Ajibola. I appreciate Natasha's work of building the Institute of Arts and Culture in Vienna, particularly reimagining the contributions of Dr. Amos' now lost dissertation. I see it as a powerful message that emphasizes the classical and still existing European Germany's ambivalent relationship with Black knowledge production, something related to Yanda's idea of conscious ignorance in similar contexts. So that's a comment for both. Any feedback or responses to Ajibola's comments? Right. If not, Natasha, do you want to?
No, what came to mind with the Ubuntu concept, Yanda, was that I totally agree with the comment that Christianity led to us losing our spirituality and disconnecting from our belief systems. And I think that the philosophy of Ubuntu and everything that goes with it, obviously there's more, can reconnect us with our actual original souls, with our ancestors. And so I thought that was a really powerful connection that you made as well. No, but I do agree on the point that we were not considered human in the first place, Black people. Yes. So when we're talking about humanity, we actually have two strands of history. We have a history of the white human rights and freedom for all, and then it went to the French and fraternité, égalité, I forgot what that one was, but you know what I mean, the French Revolution, yeah. And during that phase, we weren't considered human. So these rights were not for us. So if you're bringing it back to Amos' work, this is what he was writing about. He's like, what about the rights for Black people? Because it was a time where at the early 18th century, where this whole idea of human rights just arose. And he's right, yeah, but what about us? But what about us? And we were not considered in that debate. Yeah, and I still think today, if we look at examples like refugees, for example, freedom of movement, even racism is a human rights violation, right? So we still do not have the same access to human rights than the white majority population does in this country. And I think that is, Ubuntu is so healing, how we can really actually even deal with that, but considering that there are two strands of history here, though. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yanda, you were also kind of mentioning, which I think ties into all three of the kind of panelist presentations, like the question of language, right? And language is a site of kind of, contestation for thinking through power, identity, and even kind of self-love. And I'm struck by, for instance, thinking about kind of the status of German as a language, how in the US in particular, for instance, when foreign languages are taught, sometimes they're called world languages, it's always the same three, right? It's French, Spanish, and German, right? And to think about that also, then, could you say a bit more about kind of how language acquisition can be a part of our decolonization? So for instance, at many schools, African languages are simply not offered, right, as a part of the curriculum. You can perhaps take maybe one semester or one course, but in terms of kind of counting for your actual language requirement, it's very rare to kind of have an offering of Swahili, for instance, or Tree or something else. So maybe you could speak to what it means then to kind of decolonize our language learning, right? Even if you're not born with or grew up, in a kind of multilingual household, how acquiring an African language might be a part of the process of rethinking who we are as Black people.
Yes, I think this is an important task for both Africans and Europeans. So our responsibility as Africans is to be proud of our cultures, to be proud and also of their languages, because I would say the language is a representative of our cultures as well. Because often what I observed was that we've been engineered to carry shame in speaking proudly and articulately our mother tongues. Back in Africa, I know it's a huge issue in the southern parts of Africa. It might not be the same in other parts of Africa, but in South Africa, definitely, from a very young age. And so the responsibility for Africans really would be to first take pride in their languages, to learn and to use them, because it's exactly the same attitude in Europe when I look around. And so now for Europeans, and I would say the European education systems, the responsibility would also be, if we're talking about the curriculum, actually not only within the curriculum. So yes, in the curriculum, offer African languages, and also start with the description and the wording. Do not call them indigenous, so don't exoticize them. Do not describe them on an unequal scale. Describe them equally as you would other European languages. So if you're saying world languages, include African languages in that description of world languages as well. That is very important, even though we take it for granted, because a child might not think about it, for example, if you're exposed to these languages at school, even if you don't take that language, but just knowing they offer this language. But the fact that it is called an indigenous language already makes it small. And so it already drills it in your consciousness that you don't need that language in life, versus a European language being called a world language, because it gives it prominence and importance that you need it everywhere you go in life. And yes, it is that, but it needs to stop, because all languages are important, and African languages should be put at should be given the prominence that they deserve as well. And I think also I've heard, maybe it's different, or maybe it's not so rife in European, specifically German schools anymore, but I heard that growing up, in some schools, some students, specifically of Turkish descent, but I think this would apply to students, the children of African descent as well, who speak African languages, were not allowed to speak those languages at school. And so this again speaks to the shame that a person who does not speak a European language as a first or a native has to carry. So that needs to be denormalized. It needs to be problematized. And I think this is where academia comes in. This is also where activism comes in, because we cannot be aware of this. The people who reproduce these injustices cannot be aware of this if they are not made to be aware of them. The fact that it continues as if it is normal. And what has been interesting for me is that the insistence of these rules I was talking about earlier on in my presentation, it cushions and perpetuates and also reproduces these injustices, because one might say, no, you have to, this is Germany, so you must learn the language. It's true, but what about the attitude behind you telling me I need to learn the language? It's not like I didn't know that if I go to a foreign country, I need to learn the language so as to be able to navigate life better in the foreign land. But if the attitude says that I need to learn this language within 10 minutes of my arrival, and if I don't speak this language, I cannot communicate with the people around here, then that's wrong. You're alienating the foreigner and you're creating an unwelcoming environment. And so there needs to be, I think, a committed responsibility of European citizens, of European governing structures. Everybody should take the responsibility of this. And so when we're talking about governing structures, it also fits into the sectors of society, with the education system being one of the key and crucial ones, to take it upon themselves to ensure that first you look at the attitude and you focus at the attitude with which you receive and engage with foreigners, because that already sets the tone of how they navigate life in the spaces, whether they continue, you know, feeling alienated or not. And I think that's the reason why Black Germans who've been in Germany for generations, or Black Europeans who've been in Europe and even the Americas for generations, still feel like they do not belong. It's because of this attitude that has maintained, again, what I've been calling a commitment to ignorance, because it's really ignorance. It can't be anything more than that, bad ignorance, for you to continue dehumanizing and excluding people just because of the skin tone that they carry. So yes, in short, I would say it's everybody's responsibility, but maybe mostly our responsibility as Africans, because we experience really the injustices that come with being excluded by virtue of not holding the language capital at a given time. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of our panelists. I mean, as we're talking about conjunction of kind of race and nation, I think what we're also kind of bringing up, excuse me, is a conjunction of also nation and language, right? And so there's also this kind of myth that, you know, German is the language of Germany, when there are multiple languages that flourish in any given nation. Certainly in the US, it's a multilingual space, but English kind of comes off as the official language when it's not even a legal precedent for that as well. And certainly in Germany, so many languages flourish. And so this idea that kind of German is used as a way of kind of subordinating people, excluding them, is also part of the issue. We're actually at 5 minutes over our time, but I want to thank all of our panelists so much for your presentations. Really informative, really provocative. And I think all of your links, thank you, Emily, have been placed in the chat box so folks can look you up further and make contact and continue to engage with your work. Excuse me. So thank you all so much for a wonderful panel. Looking forward to the rest of the keynotes and talks for the rest of the day. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank